She was 14 years old, and she had nowhere left to sleep. Ada Mercer stood on the porch of the only home she had ever known in Copper Hollow, Nebraska Territory, in the autumn of 1877, while her uncle Silas Mercer told her, in a voice as flat as a closed ledger, that she was a thief and no niece of his. She left with a carpetbag, $4 sewn into her hem, and a locket that had belonged to her mother. 12 years later, with almost nothing left of that $4 and nothing at all of her name's good standing, she would spend the last $3 she owned on a collapsing, forgotten icehouse at the edge of that same town. A structure so rotted that men laughed when she asked the auctioneer to sell it to her. They did not know that beneath its sawdust floor, packed in ice that had not melted in a decade, something waited that would silence every gossiping tongue in the county and give her back the one thing money never could. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ada Mercer. If you have ever been told you were worth less than the ground you stood on, and found out later that the ground itself disagreed, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Ada Mercer had been born in the spring of 1863 in a soddy on the Copper Hollow bottomland, the only child of Thomas and Eliza Mercer, who had come west from Ohio with little more than a wagon, 2 mules, and the stubborn conviction that a person's worth was measured by what they built rather than what they were given. Thomas Mercer was not a wealthy man, but he was a careful one, and he had claimed a good stretch of land along Willow Creek in the years before the railroad came through and made every acre in the county worth fighting over. Eliza taught Ada to read from a single water-stained Bible and a farmer's almanac. And Thomas taught her to work, to set a post true, to judge weather by the color of the sky at dusk, and, most of all, to understand ice. In those years before ice boxes were common even in the cities, a man who knew how to cut, store, and preserve ice through a Nebraska summer was as valuable as a doctor. And Thomas Mercer had built the finest icehouse in 3 counties. A squat building of thick double walls packed with sawdust, where blocks cut from the frozen creek in January were kept solid clear into August. He taught Ada the trade the way some fathers teach their daughters to sew, patiently, and as though it mattered, because it did. She learned to read the thickness of creek ice by the sound it made underfoot, to know that sawdust from cottonwood insulated better than pine, and to understand that cold, properly kept, did not weaken with time, it simply waited. That lesson, more than any other, would return to her later in a form she could not have imagined as a girl of 10, sitting on her father's shoulders and watching him lower ice blocks into the dark of the icehouse floor. When Ada was 11, the diphtheria came through the Willow Creek Valley the way it came through so many settlements in those years, and it took her mother first, and then, 6 terrible weeks later, her father. She had no living relations closer than her father's younger brother, Silas Mercer, a man who had drifted between towns doing surveying work and speculating on land claims, and who arrived at the farm within a fortnight of Thomas's burial, with a black suit, a soft voice, and papers for Ada to sign. She was 11, grieving and trusting, and she signed what her uncle told her a child in her position must sign, understanding almost nothing except that her uncle now controlled her father's land, her father's cattle, and the small store of money her parents had saved. For 3 years, Silas Mercer played the part of a grieving, dutiful guardian in front of the town, while privately he sold off the cattle, leased the good bottomland to a neighboring rancher named Otis Pruitt, and let the icehouse, the one true legacy Thomas Mercer had built with his own hands, stand empty and unused, because Silas had no patience for a trade that required patience. Ada, for her part, kept the values her parents had given her even as the household around her grew colder. She helped neighbors without being asked, mended what she could, and quietly, without her uncle's knowledge, kept practicing the old skills her father had taught her, cutting a little ice from the creek in winter and packing it in an old shed just to keep her hands remembering what they knew. It was, she would later understand, the only inheritance her uncle had never managed to take from her. The accusation came in October of 1877, 3 days after Ada turned 14. Silas Mercer told the sheriff, and then told the town, that $40 had gone missing from a tin box he kept in his study, and that he had found Ada's handkerchief beside the empty box. Ada had never touched the box. She would learn, decades later, exactly why her uncle needed the town to believe she had. But at 14, she understood only that the man who was supposed to protect her stood in front of the general store and called her a thief in front of half of Copper Hollow, and that the sheriff, embarrassed and unwilling to jail a child, instead simply let Silas cast her out of the house that had once been her parents'. No one in town stepped forward to take her in. A rumor of theft traveled faster and stuck harder than any explanation Ada could offer. And within a week she understood that Copper Hollow, the only home she had, no longer had a place for her. She left with her mother's locket, $4, and a silence in her chest that would take 12 years and a rotting building to finally break open. The years between 14 and 26 took Ada through half a dozen towns along the rail lines of Nebraska and Kansas, and she survived them the way a person survives a long winter, not by any single stroke of fortune, but by an accumulation of small, stubborn choices. She worked as a hired girl in Ogallala, as a laundress in North Platte, and for 2 years as an assistant to an elderly Icehouse keeper in a town called Prairie Bend, a man named Ezra Colton, who recognized in her, within a week of hiring her, a knowledge of ice and cold storage that most grown men in the trade did not possess. Ezra Colton had no children of his own, and in the years she worked for him he taught her the finer points of the business: how to negotiate contracts with butchers and breweries, how to read the market for ice in a growing town. And when he died in the winter of 1885, he left her $50 in his will, the largest sum of money Ada had ever possessed outright. She used part of it to travel, still searching, without quite admitting it to herself, for some way back toward the life that had been taken from her, and part of it simply to eat and to keep a roof over her head as work grew scarce and the railroad towns filled up with more desperate hands than there were jobs. By the spring of 1889, at 26 years old, Ada Mercer had $3.40 to her name, a carpet bag with 2 dresses and her mother's locket, and a decision to make about whether to keep drifting or to go back, one final time, to the one place that had never let her stay. She came back to Copper Hollow not because she expected welcome, but because she had heard, from a traveling drummer she met on the road, that the county was auctioning off a parcel of abandoned buildings near Willow Creek to settle unpaid taxes, and among them, unnamed and unremarked upon in the notice, was an old ice house. Ada did not need to ask which one. She arrived in town on a gray April morning and found Copper Hollow larger than she remembered, but somehow smaller in spirit. The general store had a new owner. Half the faces on the street were strangers, and yet the old courthouse steps where the auction was held looked exactly as they had the day her uncle disowned her. She stood at the back of a thin crowd of ranchers and speculators, and when the auctioneer came to the last item on his list, a derelict ice house and quarter-acre along Willow Creek, condemned as unsafe, sold as is, nobody bid at all. The auctioneer, eager to be rid of it, looked out over the crowd and, more as a joke than a genuine offer, said he would let it go for $3 to anyone willing to take the liability off the county's books. Ada raised her hand before she had fully decided to. A ripple of laughter went through the men nearby, one of whom she recognized, with a jolt, as Otis Pruitt, the rancher who had once leased her father's land from her uncle, now gray and thick around the middle, laughing along with the rest at the foolish woman throwing away good money on a building that would likely collapse on her the first hard rain. Ada paid her $3, took the deed, and walked the half-mile out to Willow Creek alone, telling herself she had bought only a roof, however broken, and a plot of ground that had once, a very long time ago, belonged to people who loved her. The ice house her father had built stood exactly where she remembered it, though time had not been kind. Half the roof had caved inward, letting rain and sun spoil the old sawdust insulation, and the double walls, once so carefully constructed, sagged like a tired old man's shoulders. Ada spent her first 3 nights in Copper Hollow, sleeping in the driest corner of that ruin, waking each morning to clear brush and rotted timber, and it was on the 4th day, while prying up a section of the warped floorboards near the northeast corner to see whether the foundation beneath was salvageable, that her crowbar struck something that did not sound like dirt or stone. She knelt and worked more carefully, brushing aside decades of packed sawdust that had turned nearly to soil, and found beneath the floorboards a second, lower floor. A false floor her father must have built, she realized with a tightening in her chest, because she remembered him telling her once, half in jest, that a good ice house always kept its coldest secrets furthest from the door. Beneath that second floor lay a shallow brick-lined cellar, no larger than a modest cellar for root vegetables, and packed into it, astonishingly, was ice, old, gray. Compacted ice that had survived a decade of neglect because the insulation above it, ruined as it looked from outside, had done exactly what her father built it to do. And half buried in that ancient ice, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth and was now brittle and stiff with cold, was a metal strongbox. It took Ada the better part of an hour, working with a hatchet and her bare, aching hands, to chip the box free without damaging whatever lay inside it, and when she finally carried it out into the pale April sunlight and forced the rusted latch with a length of iron pipe, she found herself looking down at a bundle of papers so well preserved by the cold and the oilcloth that the ink might have been written the week before. There were deeds, not to her father's land alone, but to nearly 24 parcels along Willow Creek and the surrounding bottomland, parcels she recognized by name as belonging, in the present day, to families she remembered from her childhood, families like the Hallorans and the Vasquez brothers and old widow Ferris. There was a ledger in her father's careful hand, dated in the months before his death, recording payments he had quietly made on behalf of neighbors who could not afford the filing fees the land office charged, so that their claims would be registered properly and permanently in their own names, rather than left vulnerable to a loophole in the territorial land law that allowed unfiled claims to be challenged and reassigned. And beneath the ledger, in a separate oilskin pouch, there was a letter addressed simply to whoever finds this, written in her father's hand and dated only 3 weeks before the fever took him, in which he explained, with the plain honesty that had defined his whole life, that he feared his younger brother Silas had been quietly buying up unfiled claims throughout the valley under other men's names, intending to consolidate them once opportunity allowed, and that he, Thomas, had hidden these true deeds in the coldest, least likely place he could think of, beneath the ice, because a man in a hurry to steal land rarely thinks to dig through a floor of frozen sawdust to find it. Ada sat on the cold, damp ground of her father's ice house for a long while after reading that letter, understanding at last the shape of the injustice that had swallowed her childhood. Her uncle had not accused her of theft out of any real belief in her guilt. He had needed her gone, and quickly, because as long as she remained in Copper Hollow, growing older, growing more capable of asking hard questions about her father's estate, She represented a threat to whatever plan he had for the land he had been slowly gathering under his control. Casting her out as a thief solved two problems at once. It removed her from the house and from the town's sympathy, and it let him step forward as the wronged, generous guardian who had done his Christian duty by a troubled niece and was owed nothing further by anyone. In the 12 years since, Silas Mercer had done precisely what her father feared. He had consolidated unfiled claims across the valley. Sometimes through outright purchase from desperate families, sometimes through legal maneuvers that exploited the very loophole her father had tried to protect his neighbors from, until he now held, under various arrangements and partnerships, the deed or effective control of nearly every acre her father's ledger described. He was, by 1889, the wealthiest man in Copper Hollow, a deacon at the church, a benefactor of the new schoolhouse, and universally regarded as a pillar of the community, a reputation built. Ada now understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its certainty, on the theft of a dead man's careful protections for his neighbors, and on the ruin of a 14-year-old girl's name. Ada did not act rashly. She had spent too many years learning patience from cold storage and hard winters to throw away an advantage on a moment's anger. She spent the following weeks quietly rebuilding just enough of the icehouse to make it weatherproof, sleeping there each night among her father's rescued papers, and by day she walked the valley, reacquainting herself with the families named in the ledger, listening far more than she spoke. She learned that Maria Vasquez, whose husband had died 2 winters before, was being pressed by a lawyer working for Silas Mercer to sell her family's grazing land at a fraction of its worth, under the claim that the original filing had never been properly completed. She learned that young Daniel Halloran, whose father Ada remembered fondly from childhood, had recently signed papers he did not fully understand, trading a share of his water rights to Silas in exchange for forgiveness of a debt Ada suspected had been manufactured in the first place. Piece by piece, the pattern of her uncle's slow theft revealed itself, always dressed in the respectable language of contracts and loans and legal necessity, always aimed at people too tired, too grieving, or too unfamiliar with the land office's paperwork to fight back. And always, quietly, undergirding every one of Silas Mercer's schemes, was the reputation he had built for himself in the very act of destroying hers. It was inevitable that word would reach Silas Mercer that his niece had returned to Copper Hollow and bought, of all things, the old Icehouse on Willow Creek. And inevitable, too, that he would come to see for himself. He arrived on a Sunday afternoon in a fine buggy, dressed in the same soft black he had worn 12 years before, older now, heavier, but with the same flat, careful voice, and he found Ada on her knees repairing a section of the icehouse wall with fresh cottonwood boards. He told her, not unkindly, that he was surprised she had returned to a town that remembered her so poorly, and that perhaps, for her own sake, she ought to consider that some doors, once closed, were better left closed. Ada rose, brushed the sawdust from her skirt, and told her uncle, in a voice as level and unhurried as his own, that she had found something of her father's that she believed the whole county would be very interested to see. She watched something flicker behind his eyes. Not fear exactly, not yet, but the first cold edge of calculation, and he left without another word, though within days Ada began to feel the pressure of his influence pressing against her from every direction. The county assessor suddenly questioned whether her $3 auction deed had been properly recorded. A local lawyer, retained, she was quite sure, by her uncle, sent a letter suggesting the land beneath the icehouse might revert to county ownership on a technicality. And around town, old whispers about the thieving Mercer girl resurfaced with suspicious freshness, as though someone with both motive and means had taken the trouble to remind Copper Hollow of a scandal it might otherwise have forgotten. Ada understood that a woman alone, 12 years removed from any standing in the community, could not simply walk into the sheriff's office with a box of old papers and expect justice to follow automatically. Not against a man as embedded in respectable society as her uncle had made himself. So instead of confronting Silas Mercer directly a second time, she went first to the families named in her father's ledger, laying the original documents before them at their own kitchen tables, letting Maria Vasquez and Daniel Halloran and old widow Ferris read in her father's own hand the proof that their claims had been properly and legally filed a decade before Silas Mercer ever laid a legal challenge against them. She watched relief and anger move across their faces in equal measure, and one by one, quietly, without any dramatic gathering or public accusation, these families began to consult a young circuit lawyer newly arrived in the county. A serious, careful man named Walter Beck, who had no history with Silas Mercer and no reason to fear him. Together, over the course of a tense and quiet month, Walter Beck cross-referenced the deeds in Ada's box against the territorial land office records in the county seat and confirmed exactly what Thomas Mercer's letter had promised, that every claim named in the ledger had indeed been properly filed and paid for in 1876 and early 1877. Filings that, curiously, appeared to be missing entirely from the land office's own retained copies. Records that had somehow been lost or misfiled in the very years Silas Mercer began his quiet consolidation of the valley. The confrontation, when it finally came, was neither loud nor violent, which suited Ada far better than any dramatic reckoning could have. The county held a hearing that autumn, called at Walter Beck's request, to review a cluster of disputed land claims along Willow Creek, and Silas Mercer arrived expecting, Ada was quite certain, to face nothing more than a handful of confused settlers he could out-argue and out-lawyer as he always had. He had not accounted for the strongbox, preserved for 12 years in ice his own brother had packed with more foresight than Silas had ever credited him with, nor for the fact that his niece, whom he had cast out as an unlettered, penniless child, had returned with a circuit lawyer, a stack of original deeds bearing dates and filing stamps that predated every one of his own claims, and a ledger in her father's hand that laid out, in patient, damning detail, exactly which families he had pressured, and exactly how. Ada did not shout at her uncle across that hearing room, though she had imagined, on cold nights over the preceding 12 years, 100 different speeches she might one day deliver to him. She simply stood, when asked, and told the room the plain facts of what she had found beneath the floor of her father's icehouse, and let the documents speak the rest. She watched Silas Mercer's careful composure crack, slowly and then all at once, as the county recorder confirmed that the original 1877 filings matched precisely the records missing from his own office's ledgers. Records that could only have been removed by someone with access to them at the time. Access that, as it happened, Silas Mercer, then a frequent visitor to the land office on behalf of his supposed ward, had certainly possessed. The restoration that followed was not the sort that made for a triumphant, singular moment, but rather a slow unwinding of 12 years of quiet theft, handled with more mercy than Silas Mercer had ever shown his niece. The disputed claims were returned in full to the families who had rightfully held them. The Vasquez grazing land and the Halloran water rights restored by county order within weeks. Silas Mercer, facing the near certainty of criminal charges for land fraud and the destruction of public records, was persuaded by Walter Beck, at Ada's own quiet request, to sign over the remainder of his improperly consolidated holdings rather than face trial, and to leave Copper Hollow entirely. A punishment that cost him everything he had built his respectability upon without requiring Ada to spend the rest of her life as a witness in a courtroom battle. He left in the same fine buggy he had arrived in, though considerably poorer and utterly without the standing that had once made him untouchable. And Copper Hollow, in the plain, unhurried way of small towns, simply stopped speaking his name with respect and began instead to speak Ada's with something closer to wonder. She did not ask for her father's original homestead back, though it was legally hers to reclaim. She asked instead that the Icehouse and its quarter-acre remain hers, and that the rest of what had been recovered be used to establish a small county fund to help families properly file and protect their land claims, so that no one in the valley would ever again lose their home, simply because they did not understand the paperwork that governed it. By the following spring, Ada Mercer had rebuilt her father's icehouse into something sturdier and finer than it had ever been, its double walls packed once more with good cottonwood sawdust, its ice cut fresh each January from Willow Creek, exactly as her father had taught her, and the business she built there over the following years became, in its own quiet way, as much a fixture of Copper Hollow as it had been in her childhood, a place where butchers and homesteaders and the new dairy that opened along the creek all came to store what needed keeping cold. She never married, choosing instead to raise Maria Vasquez's youngest daughter alongside her own hired help, teaching the girl the same careful trade her father had once taught her. And in the evenings when the ice was cut and stacked and the long summer light stretched gold across the bottomland, townsfolk who passed the old icehouse sometimes saw her sitting on its step, her mother's locket at her throat, looking entirely at peace in a place that had once been the site of the worst injustice of her life and had become, instead, the foundation of everything good that came after. And so we return to where we began, to a 14-year-old girl cast out with $4 and a locket, and to the 26-year-old woman who came back with $3 and a decision not to let a rotted building or a rotted reputation define what remained possible for her. Ada Mercer never set out to expose her uncle or to become the valley's quiet benefactor. She set out only to buy back a small piece of what her father had built, trusting, the way he had taught her to trust cold and patience and careful work. That value does not vanish simply because it has been buried, or frozen, or forgotten by everyone but the one person willing to dig. What was hidden beneath that icehouse floor did not merely silence the gossip that had followed her for 12 years. It restored, piece by piece, the trust an entire community had once misplaced, and it proved, in the end, that her father's last careful act of love had been waiting for her all along, patient as ice in a Nebraska summer, for exactly as long as it took her to come home and find it. Thank you for spending this time with Ada Mercer and the icehouse that held her father's last gift to her. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs a reminder that what looks worthless to everyone else can still be worth everything to the right hands. Before you go, we would love to know, what is a time you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. Until next time, stay close.